First of all, I want to thank Straminski for the invitation. The seminar of today will be dedicated totally to estrous cycle in bovine. Apparently a very simple argument, but is an extremely important topic. If you don't manage very well an estrous cycle, it's impossible the management of the follicular dynamics. And without the management of the follicular dynamics, all the hormonal therapy or also the prediction of the window of the estrous cycle is practically impossible. So I believe that this argument will be very useful for all the practitioners that want to be involved in bovine reproduction. Thank you very much.
If we don't know the estrous cycle, we cannot deal with the follicular dynamics. And not knowing the follicular dynamics consciously, managing any hormonal therapy is practically impossible. The estrous cycle is the set of changes that occur cyclically in the ovaries and uterus, thanks to secretion to a groups of hormones. Well, 4 service stations are involved in the process. Station 1, hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces and releases genital age. Station 2, anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary produces and releases 2 gonadotropins, FSH and LH. Station 3, ovaries. The ovaries produce and release estrogen, produced by the follicles, and progesterone, produced by the corpus luteum. Station 4, uterus. The uterus is responsible for production of prostaglandin, such as PGF2 alpha, responsible for the luteolysis. All these stations work in synchronization, as we will see shortly, through a feedback mechanism which can be positive, stimulating, or negative, blocking. The hypothalamus produces genital age, which has the function of stimulating the release of anterior pituitary gonadotropins. In daily practice, we use synthetic genital age analogs every day in the synchronization of the ovulation or in the therapy of ovarian cyst. The anterior pituitary produces FSH, responsible for follicular recruitment, and LH, responsible for the growth of the dominant follicle, for their maturation in graft follicle, and their ovulation. In the ovary, we find follicles and corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces progesterone, responsible for maintaining gestation, and in presence of low level of progesterone, early and late embryonic death rate will increase. The follicles are responsible for the production of estrogens, which exert a positive feedback on the hypothalamus. Estrogens are responsible for the estrous signal. Well, the uterus produces prostaglandins, in particular prostaglandin PGF2 alpha, which has a luteolytic effect, and is therefore responsible for the destruction of the corpus luteum if there was no maternal recognition of the gestation. Well, in summary, generate stimulates the release of FSH responsible for follicle recruitment, and LH, which, depending on the progesterone level, determines the growth of the dominant follicle and then also its ovulation. Progesterone is responsible for the regularity of the cycle and for the formation and maintenance of the gestation. Thanks to their positive feedback effect on the hypothalamus, estrogens regulate the release of pituitary gonadotropins and are responsible for the estrus. PGF2 alpha is produced by the uterine endometrium in absence of gestation. The terms luteolysis, or the destruction of the corpus luteum, which stop producing progesterone, responsible for the negative feedback on the hypothalamus, so the cow can be prepared to a new estrous cycle. The cow is an animal with annual polyestrus without significant conditioning by the photoperiod, which instead influence the cyclicity of small ruminant and equines. The ovarian cycle, depending on the number of follicular waves, have a length of 18-24 days. The estrous cycle is divided in two phases. A follicular phases, in turn formed by proestrus and estrus, and luteal phases, in turn formed by metaestrus and diestrus. By convention, the ovarian cycle of the cows is considered to be 21 days. 5 days of metaestrus, 11 days of diestrus, 4 days of proestrus, and 1 day on heat or estrus. Ovulation marks the start of a new estrus cycle or the start of the first day of metaestrus. During the follicular phase, we have the maturation of the dominant follicle, of the last waves in graft follicle, and hence with the ovulation of the graft follicle. The luteal phase begins with the ovulation of the graft follicle, and during the luteal phase there is the follicular recruitment and the deviation of the dominant follicles. During this phase, the corpus luteum is formed and developed. In metaestrus, the collapsed graft follicle, thanks to LH, turns in a corpus luteum. The granulosa and theca cell will transform into big and small luteal cell. The corpus luteum of the first 24-48 hours is called hemorrhagic body or hemorrhagic corpus luteum due to its appearance. It is formed by the microhemorrhage that develop within the ovulation of the graft follicle. The estrus, it is the longest part of the estrous cycle. In this window, the corpus luteum reaches its maximum development and the maximum production of progesterone. In the absence of a maternal recognition of the gestation, the endometrium produces PGF2 alpha, which determines the luteolysis of the corpus luteum. Around day 16 of the estrous cycle, the luteal phase ends and the follicular phase begins. The proestrus is starting. During the luteal phase, we have seen that there is the recruitment of the follicles of the first and the second follicular waves. And in case of free follicular waves cows, also the recruitment of the follicles of the third and last follicular waves. During the same period, so during the luteal phase, we have also the maturation and the atresia of the first dominant follicle and also the second dominant follicle in case of free follicular waves cows. What we are seeing now is the hormonal trend, or how the different hormones involved in the estrous cycle behave during the different phases of the cycle. We are looking at FSH, responsible for follicular recruitment. It drops rapidly but remains at baseline level into the first 48 hours post-ovulation. And when the coartal follicles reach to 5 mm in diameter, the production of inhibin starting, this determines a rapid fall of the FSH. At the minimum level of FSH on day 4 post-ovulation, we have the deviation of the first dominant follicle. The peak of FSH always determines the recruitment of a new follicular waves. Whenever the FSH drops to minimum level, we have the deviation of a dominant follicle. LH. LH is responsible for dominant follicle growth and ovulation of the graft follicle. Follicular growth is mediated by LH pulse, while ovulation depends on LH surge. the level of LH is inversely proportional to the progesterone level. High progesterone level, low LH, and vice versa. Progesterone. The progesterone level in the first 4 days of the new cycle, regardless of the size of the corpus luteum, is low. And at the time of the deviation of the first dominant follicle, we have a progesterone level of about 2 nanogram per milliliters. During the estrus, the volume of the corpus luteum increases, and the production of progesterone increases too. And during this phase, the level of estrogen is minimal, like LH pulsatility. If there is a maternal reconnaissance of the gestation or a chronic inflammation of the uterus, the corpus luteum persists. Otherwise, the endometrium begins to produce PGF2 alpha, which causes a rapid fall of the progesterone. Estrogens. The level of estrogens, although decreasing, is relatively high in the first 24-36 hours post-ovulation, after which the level drops drastically, remaining at low levels through the estrus. During proestrus, the level of estrogens increase to peak during estrus. The entire estrus cycle is regulated by the hypothalamic anterior pituitary ovary axis through a positive and negative feedback mechanism produced by estrogens and by progesterone. Well, service station 1 hypothalamus produces hormones that stimulate service station 2 anterior pituitary, which in turn produce hormones FSH, LH that interact positively on the service station 3 ovary, which produce 2 types of hormones, estrogens and progesterone. Well, the hormones produced by service station 3 ovaries are estrogens and progesterone, which respectively determine a stimulation of service station 1 hypothalamus to produce its hormone GnRH, or a depression of the same production through the progesterone. Well, therefore, when we have high estrogens level, we necessarily have low progesterone level. In the presence of high estrogens level, we have high level of GnRH, FSH, and LH. In the presence of high progesterone level, LH level are very low. But attention, because during the estrus we have the start of the second and, in case of free follicular waves, of the third follicular waves, induced by a peak of FSH, in turn stimulated by a peak of GnRH produced by the estrogens of the dominant follicle. In this case, the GnRH peak only induces a spike of FSH, but not in LH, due to the high level of progesterone, which block the release of LH. If not, the Carl cycle will be 8-10 days long and not 21. PGF2 alpha is produced by the endometrium and exit the uterus with the uterus vein, which is literally circumscribed by ramification of the ovaries arteries. This intimate connection between the vein and the branch of the ovary arteries determines the passage of prostaglandin PGF2 alpha from the vein to the artery and to the branch destined to the ovaries. Well, PGF2 alpha also determines vasoconstriction, responsible for the reduction of the blood flow to the corpus luteum, which will therefore undergo to a hyaline degeneration. The corpus luteum produces oxytocin, which will stimulate the endometrium to produce other PGF2 alpha, which in turn will continue luteolysis. It is a self-amplifying mechanism. The production of progesterone is in large and small luteal cell decreases until it ceases. The negative feedback on the progesterone on the hypothalamus disappears and the cow is ready for a new estrus. In this slide, I have summarized the entire estrus cycle, recalling once again how everything is regulated by a perfect collaboration between hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, ovaries, and uterus. When this mechanism is interrupted for some reason, conditions are created for the development of pathologies such as anestrus. At the beginning of this seminary, I remembered how knowledge of the ovarian cycle is fundamental in order to correctly use the hormones that we are daily using in therapy. Prostaglandin PGF2 alpha can always be used in presence of a functional corpus luteum. GnRH works only in the presence of an active dominant follicle, the only one capable of guaranteeing a sufficient number of LH receptors on its surface. HCG works exactly like GnRH, only in the presence of an active dominant follicle of at least 8-10 millimeters. This is the minimum size of the follicle in a dairy cattle, which guarantees a sufficient number of LH receptors. GnRH compared to HG determines a faster LH peak within 2 hours, but less lasting. On the other hand, HG determines a slower but more intense and more prolonged peak. The HG or PMG is not tied to the size of the follicles and also works on very small follicles. It has a very long half-life of around 56-60 hours. Well, in this last slide, there is a summary of what we have just discussed until now.
Well, we are arrived at the end of this seminar. Estrus cycle, as I told when we started, is extremely important. We have seen that the estrus cycle length is between 18 and 24 days. The number of the days of the estrus cycle depend from the number of the follicular waves. The estrus cycle in 2 follicular waves is shorter, in 3 follicular waves is longer. However, we have to remember that during the estrus cycle we have 2 different phases. One is the luteal phases with metaestrus and diestrus, and the second one is follicular phases. The follicular phases include proestrus and estrus. During the metaestrus, we have the recruitment of the first follicular waves and the deviation of the first dominant follicles. In the estrus, we have the growth of the first dominant follicle and its atresia, recruitment of the second follicular waves, deviation of the second dominant follicle. Well, during the proestrus, we have the maturation of the last dominant follicle in a graft follicle, and at the end, during the estrus, we have the ovulation of the graft follicles. Well, all the estrus cycle is regulated by the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, ovary axis, and the hormones that are involved in this in this process are GnRH, are gonadotropins produced by anterior pituitary, FSH and LH, and then we have estrogens that are produced inside to the ovaries by the follicles, and progesterone produced by the corpus luteum. But last but not least, we have not to forget the production of prostaglandin, in particular PGF2 alpha, produced by the uterus inside to the endometrium. Thank you very much for your attention.